Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing a review of Heartless by Marissa Meyer. This is one of my ultimate guilty pleasure reads. I do have an unreasonable love for this book, yet I will be objective because I understand that this book has flaws and I definitely do want to discuss those flaws in more detail. So check out the timestamps below if you wish to skip ahead. Okay, so before I start the review, there are a few things that you should probably know before going in. Number one, this book is an Alice in Wonderland retelling. It is set in the world of Wonderland. I have not read the original Alice in Wonderland. If I do gush about the world building later on in this review, I probably will, then it's probably because I don't have a point of reference. So that's disclaimer number one. Disclaimer number two is that I do not read the blurbs of books before going into them because it does affect my objectivity. For example, if you know what kind of retelling this book is, you'll be able to guess a lot of the plot twists. However, in my case, I didn't know anything about this book going in. So yeah, just keep in mind that I probably will be a little bit biased. However, I will try to be as objective as I can because in retrospect, I did realize a lot of the flaws of this book. So let's get into it. Okay, so let me talk about the positives first. Marissa Meyer is honestly one of my favorite YA authors because her prose is really fantastic. It maintains that perfect balance between simple prose and purple prose. And for me, that's something that I really love in any author because I don't like it when prose gets super pretentious. Yet on the other hand, I don't like it when prose is so simple to the point that it doesn't really have a style. Marissa Meyer's prose definitely has a style, and that's one of my favorite things about her as an author. And her prose is particularly suited to this world of Wonderland because the creepiness of Heartless was really interesting to me. You don't really see that many gothic or horror-like atmospheres in YA, and yet Marissa Meyer was able to bring out the unsettling nature of Heartless so incredibly well. I thought that there were moments that actually made me like very uncomfortable, and yet for some reason I did not understand exactly why I was feeling so uncomfortable. But that's one of my favorite things about this book because I just kind of felt very unsettled and creeped out all throughout this book. Furthermore, Marissa Meyer has really fantastic dialogue. When two characters in a room are able to just kind of have long periods of conversations and the dialogue doesn't feel stilted or awkward, that is a huge success in my book. And actually, some of the dialogue was really quite funny at times. Marissa Meyer has a knack for writing characters that are non-generic. The characters themselves are incredibly colorful. Not to mention, I think that teenagers who read this book will definitely be able to relate to the main character's motivation of wanting to just kind of find her own way in life and not have her parents interfere in her life or try to take over her life. I think that's a huge thing that not only teenagers go through, but also even adults. So in that sense, the characters in this book definitely have relatable motivations. Furthermore, I really liked the character interactions because regardless of how this book ends and whether you were able to predict the ending or not, regardless of all those things, I think the one thing that I can steadfastly stand by is that I think that the friendships were really fantastic. The evolution of these friendships is really the biggest emotional takeaway from this book in my opinion. So despite in retrospect realizing the flaws of this book, it's still my guilty pleasure because those friendships are so fantastic. Last but not least, I really enjoyed the finale of this book. There's basically no consequences in most YA books, yet for Heartless, I really enjoyed the emotional consequences of this. It is why I really did enjoy this book as much as I did. Okay, so now that I got the positives out of the way and why I was able to kind of give this book like extra brownie points compared to other YA books, the fact that this book has a really creepy gothic atmosphere, the fact that it has strong friendships, and also a finale that has consequences, which is again not very typical of most YA books. I would like to discuss some of the flaws of this book and why so many people would probably give this book like a 3-star rating as opposed to like a 5-star rating. That, in my opinion, has a lot to do with the pacing. For example, the biggest pacing issue in this book has to do with the last 10% of this book. There's a character development at the end that feels very abrupt. That is one very big thing about this book that I would criticize because with another 50 to 100 pages, I think that Marissa Meyer could have had a few more catalysts to make the ending happen in a more realistic way. However, she kind of rushed it. She kind of did a time lapse. She kind of did a time skip. Therefore, the character development at the very end, it really is not as executed as well as it could have been. This character development is probably the weakest aspect of this book because it's kind of really important. Now, the other big problem that this book has is that it's kind of got a case of insta-love. However, in this case, I was kind of able to justify the insta-love because most male love interests in YA tend to be very typically buff, typically aggressive, typically toxic. However, in this case, the love interest was completely the opposite of that. He had this very whimsical feel to him, and I found that very charming. I have a very low bar for male love interest in YA because most of the time, a lot of the male love interests can be copy and pasted from one book to another. Whereas in this book, Marissa Meyer took a risk in having this male love interest be almost I'm not gonna say feminine, but he was just very childlike almost. He had this whimsy and this innocence and this happiness to him. That's where my personal bias comes in. I hate insta-love in books. However, in this case, I think that the romance was really okay to me because not only was this love interest atypical of most YA love interests, he also had a life outside of Cat. He has a history, he has friends of his own. As a result, he kind of did feel like a three-dimensional character in certain respects. The one thing that I actually wasn't able to justify about this romance, however, was that it became very stale in the middle of the book. I didn't like how the love interest evolved. I love the fact that he started off as a charming, delightful sort of gentleman, and yet by the middle of the book, he became almost like stoic. He became very hot and cold. He was very difficult to read. There are some reasons as to why he became that way. However, I really didn't like the meandering of the romance. I found that very unnecessary, and I'm not gonna say he became toxic at all. It's just that I didn't like how he became very generic. So yeah. As much as I love the love interest at the beginning of this book, and I really like the insta-love because I personally was attracted to the love interest right away. I was very thirsty for him. I still didn't like how he evolved in a way that was very dissonant from how he started at the beginning. It just was not in line with his character at the beginning. So really, it's the romantic meandering, the push and pull. I didn't like those things. So yeah, that was my non-spoiler review of this book. Just to summarize, the things that I absolutely loved about this book is number one, again, the prose is really fantastic. The prose has great flow and yet it's still concise and very easy to read. Marissa Meyer's writing is very quirky and yet it's not pretentious. She's not trying to bog your mind with how complicated her wording can be. The world building is also really fantastic. I think that if you have read the original Alice in Wonderland, you probably will not be as surprised by the world building. However, in my case, I did not read the original Alice in Wonderland, and therefore I was very pleasantly surprised. Marissa Meyer does a really fantastic job of bringing out the gothic and creepy undertones of this world without making it too scary. Last but not least, my favorite thing about this book is definitely the friendships. Regardless of whether you like the world building or whether you think that the finale was well done, I think that the friendships are really quite solid. As for the negatives, again, I think that it really chalks up to number one, the pacing, the ending of the book with a certain character development. The character development felt extremely rushed. I can justify it because, again, if she had just simply added 50 more pages, it would have been fine because the rest of the book did an okay job of establishing certain, potential bombs. She planted certain things that could have led to that character development. However, I think that the final push of this character development was not done super well. The second thing that kind of mars this book would be the romance. Again, it has a lot to do with the pacing. In the case of the insta-love romance, I was kind of able to justify it because I personally fell in love with the love interest right upon sight. I like the fact that he was not typically masculine. However, I think that the pacing, again, mars the romance because in the middle of the book, there's a romance courting sort of thing going on. And in my opinion, it's not very necessary. That's where I feel like the pacing again affects the romance because I feel like Marissa Meyer added in this push and pull sort of thing just to kind of kill time. It could have been replaced with something else. There's more of the world building I could have liked to have seen. There's other sort of plot developments that could have obviously used more time. The romantic courting and the romantic push and pull, it made it feel very unnecessary, and at a certain point I was kind of confused by what Marissa Meyer was kind of going for. So there's a bit of a dissonance there. Would I recommend this book? Again, I've listed all the positives and the negatives. If you haven't read the blurb of this book, I would highly recommend going into it completely blind because, again, I had a really great experience. However, if you have read the blurb and know what kind of retelling this is, then, it's your choice. The bare minimum I can say for this book is that it's not going to be a horrible book, unless you really hate the main character or you really hate the other characters. However, if I were to state the maximum for this book, I love this book. The evolution of friendships is particularly amazing. So, would I recommend this book? There might be a chance that you might enjoy it.
Okay, so that was the end of my non-spoiler review. If you have not read this book, I would highly recommend checking out at this point because I will be going into rapid fire spoilers, no context, absolutely no inhibition here. So I would highly recommend checking out if you have not read this book at this point. Major spoiler ahead.
Okay, so the first spoiler that I just kind of want to discuss and get out of the way is the ending with Kath going mad. That was kind of a shock. If I had read the blurb of this book going in, I definitely would have predicted the ending, and I definitely would have thought that the execution was flimsy. Just death being the main catalyst is not a problem. I think that people can go mad if their lovers die, and I understand. However, that being the main catalyst and the only catalyst to Kath going mad, I think that was not very believable. If Kath has shown signs of madness before just death, then I could see how just death could push her over the edge. However, I think that Cath's madness needed a few more catalysts or a few more pushes, and I think that the addition of 50 to 100 more pages really could have helped. I know a lot of people say that Cath is very whiny. I've heard that people say that Cath is not communicating her anger towards her parents. So I could kind of see how people might think that Cath was being unreasonable, because she was. However, I think it is very realistic of people like that to project their anger on things or people who aren't at fault. It did kind of make sense to me. The fact that Cath was not able to kind of speak up about wanting to open a bakery, I could kind of see how her pent-up anger resulted in her becoming a little bit malicious by the end. So yeah, the fact that Just's death was the thing that really kind of made Cath go crazy, I found it believable to some extent, because I think that Cath had really no one to rely upon. I think that she felt this immense pressure that when Just came along, I could kind of see how Cath banked her entire life and her entire hope on this guy to kind of take her away from this very pressuring situation. So therefore, when that hope was lost, I could kind of see how she made a very rash decision to kind of marry the King of Hearts and like become this monarch. I could kind of see that, right? I could kind of see the sequence of events. However, again, because she didn't show those signs of madness beforehand, and also there weren't enough catalysts to push her over the edge, in my opinion, that's where the character development, it felt rather weak. But I have to say, the thing that I absolutely loved the most, number one favorite thing about this book, is the penultimate chapter. It might be the third to last chapter, I'm not exactly sure, but it's the chapter where Cath, after proposing to the King of Hearts, she goes to Hadda's place and she basically has a final confrontation with this guy. Hadda was probably my favorite character in this book right from the start, because I really liked his cynical nature. When he and Cath didn't get along, those moments of tension were just really delicious to me. I love it when characters are presented in situations where they are like very awkward and they don't know what to do. And so for me, when Hadda for some reason had this aversion towards Cath, and yet when Cath does something to win his approval, I really like the fact that they start to kind of warm up to each other. Two people not starting out as liking each other and then overcoming their dislike. I absolutely loved the relationship between Hadda and Cath as a result of that. I did love Just as a character. However, I didn't really care about his relationship with Cath, because again, I didn't really like the romantic courting. Those scenes were kind of uncomfortable for me, because to me, it kind of felt like her and Just having this romantic sort of eyeing going on, and then the king is right next to them. I didn't like the fact that they were just kind of toying with him. Instead, my favorite relationship in this book was actually definitely Hadda and Cath. The hard-earned friendship was the thing that really warmed my heart. Therefore, the fact that Cath goes to visit Hadda at the very end of this book, and in that scene, she's already kind of half mad. However, she's kind of trying to hold on to the old threads of friendship, and she's kind of trying to hold on to her sanity through that friendship. That's kind of how I interpreted that scene. And therefore, when Hadda rejects Cath and he's like, screw you, those bridges are burned, and it makes me so freaking sad, because ultimately it really is Cath's fault, yet he himself is kind of blaming himself, because the fact that he threw those pumpkin seeds in the farmer's garden and the farmer's wife ate those pumpkins and she became a monster, the Jabberwocky, as a result of that. Those revelations in this penultimate chapter, really interesting. I also was very heartbroken about that revelation that Hadda was actually in love with Just. Cath is basically saying, you don't know how I feel. She is being very self-centered in that moment, because Just was Hadda's friend. But when she basically says that to Hadda, he basically glares at her and he's like, you don't have a monopoly on your heart being stolen by someone. So he's basically saying his heart was kind of stolen, or like he did fall in love with Just as well. So that revelation made me feel so freaking sad for Hadda, because him being very cynical at the beginning, yet he was still willing to kind of overcome his biases and his aversion to Cath, his rival in love, and kind of accept her despite all of that, because he's still wanting the best for Just. And for him to finally at the very end to give up hope from running away from time, it's really sad. It's really sad. I really don't know what to say. So yeah, I think that 80% of why I love this book so much, it has a lot to do with that penultimate scene. If this penultimate scene was not there, I would not have loved this book as much. I think that the penultimate scene between Hadda and Cath, where the friendships are burned. Not only that, the revelations about the pumpkin seeds, and Hadda's revelation about how he also had this love for Just. It's kind of ridiculous. The plot twist, the emotional punches of that chapter. You don't see many books exploring such evolution of friendships. Typically, most friendships start off as people disliking each other and then becoming really good friends, or you start off as really good friends and then you see that friendship breaking down. Heartless actually had both. She had like the build-up and the decline of that friendship. It's ultimately why I love this book as much as I did. I think if this penultimate chapter was not there, I would not have felt as strongly about the finale as I would have. I also want to touch on the creepy elements of this book. There aren't that many books in general that have this gothic, creepy atmosphere. Like the Wonderland that Marissa Meyer built was extremely charming, and yet for me, like I completely fell unsettled all throughout the book because there were just some warning signs that this wonderful land would become very, very dark. That's something that I found very interesting to think about as well, because at the beginning of the book, I thought that, you know, the idea of Wonderland for me, I knew that it was going to be creepy, or I knew that it was going to be batshit crazy, and yet at the same time, the batshit crazy nature of Wonderland is really quite innocuous. It's not the type of madness, or it's not the type of craziness that will make you feel like, okay, like these characters are going to do something horrific or they're going to do something completely unpredictable. No, the characters themselves are really quite grounded in their reality. They aren't like crazy people, right? It's just the politics or like the social interactions or just the fantasy world is so different, and that's why it feels crazy. But the characters themselves aren't crazy. So at the beginning of the book, I was really quite, surprised by that, because I thought that this Wonderland would feel crazy, and yet the characters themselves were so grounded in their reality that the world building was not as horrific to me. And yet, as the book went on, the craziness started to become more ominous. I started to get really unsettled, and I didn't understand why, because at the beginning I was charmed by it, so why am I starting to feel creeped out? But the incident of mock turtle soup, I was getting goosebumps in that scene. I was legitimately kind of creeped out, and the best thing about that is that I didn't understand why. The characters themselves, when they reacted to this mock turtle thing, they weren't vocalizing exactly why mock turtle is such a bad thing. Like, what's so bad about being a mock turtle that they would be like so afraid to speak about it? The fact that these characters were just like unwilling to even talk about why this is a bad thing, or they're not even willing to let the reader know why they're so horrified by it, it made me get goosebumps. Like, I was like, I don't understand what's going on, but I can tell this is a really horrible thing. So that was one of the very first moments that I was just like really creeped out. The other thing was the lion who sacrifices himself to save Kath, I think. The fact that, he dies sacrificing himself for Kath was quite sad, but I was also quite creeped out because it felt wrong. Something about that scene felt wrong. Not because it was bad, right? It's not badly written, but the fact that the lion was just kind of taken away by this Jabberwocky and you never see him again, you understand that there's worse things to come. So it's the teeny little ominous things that start to happen throughout this book that just start to like, whoa, what's going on? The third thing that really kind of creeped me out, aside from mock turtle soup and the lion, was the sisters in the well, obviously. I didn't understand what the hell they were about, but their prophecy was kind of creepy. I wish that I had seen the warning signs. I think that, again, I was kind of being a dumbass by not understanding what those prophecies meant. But the fourth thing, right, Kath going mad, that's when my brain was like, this is a really interesting progression in terms of the world building, because again, you started with Wonderland, starting off this wonderful place, and actually not that bad. And it's really interesting that by the end, it's really Kath who makes Wonderland the dark and a kind of batshit crazy place that you see in typical stories about Alice in Wonderland, right? Kath is the one who makes Wonderland a really dark place where the Queen of Hearts cuts off people's heads. You realize that it's really this girl who introduces the darkness into Wonderland. I think that's a really interesting good note. As for Kath herself, I just really liked her as a character at the beginning. She was very practical. She had a very business-like mind, and yes, she was still kind of very easygoing and she was very fun. I think that's why her character development at the end was all the more unbelievable to me, and why I do think that it needed another 50 to 100 more pages. I also loved her relationship with food and Marianne. Her bonding with Marianne over food and all of that, I was very, very charmed. Two girlfriends are like bonding over food. It's not something that you see like in every single book. I really like the female friendship between her and Kath. That's why the second thing that I didn't like about Kath, aside from her manipulating the king, was that I didn't like her lashing out at Marianne just because Jess died. Look, I understand that Marianne getting into trouble was kind of her fault, but it's also Kath's decision to come back to Wonderland. All of their lives were ultimately ruined because she decided to come back to Wonderland and save Marianne. However, I didn't like the fact that she blamed that on Marianne, and it's not because she did blame Marianne, it's more of the fact that she was lashing out in her grief about the fact that Jess died, and she was blaming Jess' death on Marianne. Like, I don't think that Kath would have blamed Marianne if it was only her life ruined. If she was like dragged back to her parents' house as a result of Marianne getting into trouble, I don't think that she would have lashed out at Marianne. But it's basically just dying that made her want to burn bridges with Marianne. That's something that I kind of didn't like about the book. I didn't like Kath as a result of it. I didn't like the fact that a female friendship was ruined as a result of a love interest dying. I don't like it when a guy gets between two girls having a friendship and vice versa. I did like the fact though that she did burn bridges with her parents. I did think that her parents were just like really, like they were assholes. Right? They were just typical assholes. To me, it kind of felt like they saw the madness in Kath and they were like starting to rethink their decisions. And that's why they came to her and they were like, look, Kath, like if you don't want to go through this, like you don't have to. It's like, dude, like your daughter screamed at you earlier all throughout the book that she doesn't want this for her life, and yet you were so mean to her. And now you're only coming to her and saying you don't have to go through with it. What didn't click before? I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing. Like, it's too late, right? It's too late. Kath was like completely gone mad at that point. As for some of the more negative things about this book that I couldn't really go into, number one, it's about Jest. For me, Jest, again, transitions from being this very innocent and very whimsical sort of gentleman into becoming this very stoic and very detached, and I didn't like that. I don't know, I didn't like the fact that Jest was pretending not to know Kath. It's not a miscommunication. It's not like they're misunderstanding each other on purpose. It's just they're literally just looking at each other and they know they're thirsting for each other, and yet they're not talking about it. To me, that was like really frustrating and very unnecessary. I don't know, they felt dumb. And again, it's also why I didn't love Just by the end. He starts off very cute and then he becomes like very stoic, and that dissonance in this character, it made me very, very confused because I didn't understand what kind of personality he would have. Like for example, with Kath, you know that she's a very upbeat and practical person. Hada, he has a very cynical sense of humor. I like that. But with Just, I didn't really understand who he is as a character. I didn't understand like whether he was meant to be the stoic guy who had a mission to do something bad, or was he the actual charming guy that we met at the beginning? Not to mention, I did feel like when Jest renounces his mission, I did feel like him renouncing his mission and him declaring his love for Kath, I did feel like that was very much out of the blue and it was very cheesy. Because to me, I didn't feel like the romance between him and Kath was developed enough to the point that he would give up his mission. The second weird thing is the lion gets carried off by the Jabberwocky. There's a point when she goes into Peter's garden and she sees the lion's parasol hat, right? She sees the lion's hat. Now the lion at this point has been again carried off by the Jabberwocky and probably eaten alive, and she sees the lion's hat in the Peter Farmer's garden and she doesn't really react to it. She reacts to it, but then she doesn't really tell anybody. This is a huge plot hole for me, or a narrative hole that I found very dumb. I thought that Kath herself was really dumb for not telling anybody, because if she found the lion's hat, it might be a sign that the lion is wounded somewhere near this farmer's garden, or also maybe the Jabberwocky has something to do with this farmer. So why didn't she tell anybody until it's too late? Somebody might have put two and two together, and then the farmer's wife could have been revealed as a Jabberwocky. The third thing that I wanted to discuss was the Land of Chest. I'm not really sure if I should be happy or mad about this. At the point when Jest, Hada, and Kath and the Raven decide to run away to the Land of Chest together, I really want to see how the Land of Chest would compare to the Land of Wonderland. However, this was a red herring because it turns out that Kath will go back to Wonderland and basically sacrifice all of their fates. As a result, we never see the Land of Chest in this book. This is not a negative per se, because again, it's me dictating how the plot should go. I like that it was a red herring, but at the same time, I was also kind of disappointed that we never got to see the Land of Chest. Something else that I want to discuss, this is not a negative. It's the death of Jest. I like the way that it was executed. The way that Marissa Meyer writes this death is she has the farmer raise the axe, and then there's like a moment, and then the axe fell. In that next moment, Kath sees the farmer Peter running away. Now, you don't know in that moment what that exactly means, and I really like that kind of moment of ambiguity, because I think it's a really good indication of Kath not being able to register the shock of just literally being beheaded in front of her. Again, my sleep-deprived brain at that point didn't register what that meant, but it's just one of the more notable writing decisions that I really enjoyed. Yeah, good job. I wanted to discuss the Raven's fate as well. I thought that he was such a cute character. When the Raven first meets Kath, Kath sees that the Raven is speaking only in limericks. As a result, you basically think that this Raven has only the ability to speak in limericks. However, this really funny moment comes along when someone's about to come and intrude upon their conversation, and the Raven tells Jest and Kath, and he's not speaking in limericks. He's basically speaking in normal speech. And Kath points out, hey, you're not speaking in limericks. Like, she's very surprised. And the Raven responds by saying, well, who's got the time for limericks? I love the Raven from that moment on. And that's why when Kath goes mad, her kind of forcing the Raven into her fate just because they have an emotional bond over jest, that made me kind of mad. Her manipulating the king made me uncomfortable. Being mean to Marianne did make me a little bit mad. However, this whole thing about this Raven and pulling this Raven into a fate that he never even asked for, that was just sad. He's very kind of cute in real life, right? Again, like he was speaking in limericks, he's very whimsical. When he was with Jest, he was very sweet. And therefore, when Kath kind of forces the Raven or kind of emotionally manipulates this Raven into becoming her executioner, I felt bad for Kath as well, but again, that's her decision. Hada's fate was also his decision as well. But the Raven didn't really feel like it was completely his decision. It's implied that he's become the executioner for like the rest of Kath's rule. And for me, I didn't feel like the Raven had that sort of spirit in him. He might have wanted revenge against this farmer, sure, but then I don't think that he would have wanted to continue killing people. So for me, it's like I didn't really like that. As for Kata herself, her becoming heartless by the end, right? I think that the sisters in the well, they basically made a deal with Kath that if they brought her the farmer, she would give them her heart, which is why the name of this book is named Heartless. It's in this moment when she gives up her heart to the sisters that she completely loses all hope of redemption, because without her heart, it's implied that she's going to become extremely cruel and extremely actually crazy. The fact that she's kind of willing to give up her humanity and her heart in order to get revenge, that's when she really goes mad, right? That's kind of my reasoning of this scene. So that's an interesting thing to note, because now that I'm thinking about this in that light, that would imply that if she hadn't given up her heart and she had simply just executed the farmer, maybe she might have stopped her murderous spree at that point. It would indicate that she never really truly went mad. It's more that she was just very much driven by revenge, and she was also lashing out at other people just in grief. That's a really interesting thought, because then her giving up the heart, that's really ironic, because if you think about it, maybe if she was kind of approaching this from the situation of like, okay, maybe if I just kill this one guy, maybe I can just go back to being normal. But instead, again, she traded her heart for the farmer. So she may have just wanted revenge on this one guy, and yet this one revenge on this one guy made her lose her heart, and that's where she went completely permanently mad. So that's food for thought, I think, because then that would maybe pardon the biggest flaw of this book, which would again be Kath going completely mad by the end because of Jess's death. That might not be the case. Like, if that's the biggest flaw of this book, and yet if we were to approach it from the angle that she never truly went mad in that moment, she just wanted revenge and she wanted to vent her grief and anger at people and then get all that revenge out. The biggest flaw of this book, the rushed character development of Kath right after Jess's death, that would not have been a big problem. Sadly, Marissa Meyer again didn't have Kath thinking those thoughts. So yeah, ultimately the flaw of this book is still a flaw. I just wish that Marissa Meyer had Kath thinking, okay, maybe I want to go back to who I was in the past. Maybe I could have a bakery after killing this guy. And then her giving up the heart to the sisters to get that revenge would be that ironic twist of fate. But that's not the case. So the flaw of this book with Kath's rush development, it still is a flaw. Okay, so my voice is completely raw at this point. I think that I basically got everything out of my system. So let me get into the summary. Number one, the prose. Marissa Meyer has honestly one of the best prose of most YA authors I've read, because again, she just has a really great balance where it's colorful enough to the point that you really want to examine the prose, and yet it's still very easy to read and very non-pretentious. Number two, the world building. I really did think that Marissa Meyer did a really fantastic job of bringing out the gothic and creepy and horror-like elements of Wonderland, and yet still balancing that with really charming, whimsical elements and really funny moments as well. On the other hand, if you did read the original House in Wonderland, you may very possibly find that the world building is not as unique as it could have been. But again, personally, I still did think that for a non-reader, it was very much more than enough. The finale, I would give 3.5 stars. I had to round it up a little bit because despite the rushed character development in this finale, I really did think that the penultimate chapter of this book was a masterpiece. The scene between Hada and Kath was emotionally heartrending. So ultimately, I think that on the lower end, if I were to rate this book, I would give in this book 3 to 3.5 stars, because looking back on it in retrospect, I do feel like people who do know what this book is about going in, they definitely would have been disappointed by how rushed certain character developments were. However, I still have to be biased for certain elements of this book, which would be, again, the friendships. And the way that their friendships evolved throughout the book, it really just kind of set my heart on fire in a way that, like, I just emotional ruin. So yeah, that was my review. I don't know, this was a really interesting review because I don't think that this book is objectively like that great. Don't get me wrong, like I'm not ashamed of loving this book in that sense. It's just I understand that this book has some major flaws, and yet despite those flaws, I really like it. So yeah, that's the end of my rambling. Let me know what your thoughts are on this book and what your reaction to it was. My voice is completely gone, so good night.